A few days ago, Navy Federal approved me for a $25,000 credit card limit on a more rewards card in just 6 weeks. And if you've ever chased higher limits, you know how rare that is right now, just out of the gate. For a lot of people, getting limits that high takes years, multiple cards, endless credit line increase requests, kind of slowly inching your way up. So in a second, I'll show you the simple setup steps that I took before applying that likely helped trigger that 25K limit. If you've been around the credit world long enough, you've probably heard people refer to Navy Federal as the house of high limits. And for years, I've heard the same stories. People getting approved for 30K, 40K, even 80K limits from them. And that's very different from most of the large, big banks out there. With large national banks, you'll often see starting limits like, $2,000, $5,000, maybe $10,000 if you're lucky. Then you spend the next few years slowly asking for increases. Credit unions tend to operate differently, though. They're often relationship driven instead of purely algorithm driven, which means if you send the right signals early, the system sometimes rewards you immediately. So eventually, I decided it was time to test it for myself. So I joined Navy Federal less than 2 months ago. My father served in the military many years ago, which made me eligible for membership. The process was surprisingly smooth too. I expected the typical clunky credit union experience, but honestly, their software and onboarding felt just as polished as any of the big banks. Once the account was open, I did two things right away. First, I opened both a checking and a savings account. Then I made an initial $1,000 deposit. Nothing fancy. I just wanted some money sitting in there. After that, I added Navy Federal as another direct deposit destination from my business. And I just added $100 per month to that. Not a huge amount at all, but enough to signal that this wasn't going to be, a dormant account. Then I let things sit for a few weeks. And then about 6 weeks later, after opening the accounts, I decided to take a shot. So I had no pre-approval offer. Believe me, I was checking. Nothing was showing up in my dashboard. So out of curiosity, I pulled up the application on my computer and then I went through the process. Now, the application itself was straightforward. And before long, I hit submit. Then the decision came back instantly. So there was no review message, no waiting, just an approval screen. And right there on the screen, it said $25,000 credit limit. I leaned back in my chair for a second and I was just staring at that number. And I'll be honest with you, I pumped my fists, I'm not gonna lie, because that was one of the largest starting credit limits I've ever received. Naturally, the next thing I did was take a screenshot. Then I posted it to my YouTube community page, and the response was wild. People were excited for me, which was cool to see. And here's exactly what my credit profile looked like when I applied. So my credit score was around 780 with TransUnion. My utilization was 3%. For my recent inquiries, I had one in the last 6 months with TransUnion. My average age of accounts was 4 years and 5 months. My oldest account, though, was 17 years old. My total available credit across all of my cards before this approval was roughly 215K. And Navy Federal pulled TransUnion for the application. The approval was instant. My APR landed around 15%, which is actually quite low compared to most cards today. And the card also came with a $200 bonus after spending $2,000 within the first 90 days. And I would say, looking back at the process, a few things probably matter the most. I would say first were the relationship signals. Opening both a checking and a savings account, putting in $1,000 into the account, and then setting up direct deposit. Also making a few extra deposits too. I can't forget about that. I had made a couple $100, worth of deposits and transactions here and there. I also briefly applied for an auto refinance through Navy Federal before going for the credit card. The rate didn't beat my current loan, so I never moved forward with it, but it still created another interaction event with their system and showed that I was exploring their products. And I would say those actions tell the bank something really important. You're not just there for a credit card, you're becoming a real customer. And second, the credit profile itself. A FICO score around 780, utilization at 3%, and a long credit history, those all help. But that alone doesn't always produce huge starting limits at major banks. Which brings us to the third factor. Credit unions often think differently. They're not just running your credit through a rigid algorithm. They're looking at the whole relationship. And listen, I'm not done with Navy Federal yet. My plan now is to let the card age a little bit. Use it lightly. Then after 6 months, I'll request a credit limit increase. Once that happens, I'll likely apply for the Navy Federal flagship card. That one comes with some solid travel benefits and even reimburses you for Amazon Prime. So we'll see where that goes. But for now, I'm pretty happy with this first approval because sometimes, the reputation turns out to be true. And in this case, in my case, the House of High Limits really delivered. And a lot of people have been asking me about Navy Federal and assume it's off limits unless you've served in the military. But that's not true today. So click on the next video right here and see the 3 legit paths that people use to get in without lying or risking account shutdowns. Plus, how I got approved for a membership without ever having to prove military service. Thank you for watching.